Who am I that the Ancient of Days should ordain my steps in a palace where his name is neither spoken nor honored? Am I not dust, formed from exile, shaped by silence, veiled in a name not my own? And yet, why does my soul tremble with the weight of a purpose too vast for my frame? Why do I feel the breath of eternity pressing against the walls of this fleeting life? They called me Esther, a mask given to survive. But before the crown, before the perfumes, before the hush of courtiers bowing to a queen they do not know, I was Hadassah, a daughter of Judah, planted like a root in Babylonian soil, not in Zion's light, but in Susa's shadow, where gold idols glitter beneath false stars, and power speaks in decrees, not truth. Was it chance or covenant? And yet even then, I belong to a God whose ways are hidden, but not absent, whose presence burns beneath silence, like fire under embers. He was always near, closer than the breath I feared to take. I was not raised to fight. I was raised to remember the covenant alive through obedience and waiting, to light Sabbath candles in the house of mourning, to whisper psalms where temple songs had long gone quiet. They told us we were forgotten, but I knew better, because even in Susa's courts, even beneath the golden idols and laughter of men drunk with power, there was a stirring, not a rebellion of swords, but of surrender, of hearts awakened by the holy burden of purpose. I was not brave in myself, but there was a sacred ache that would not let me rest. The ache of knowing you were made for something more than self-preservation. And when Haman's decree descended like a shadow over our people, I did not weep as an orphan, but as a daughter of Zion. I had not asked for beauty, yet it became my burden. In a world ruled by appearances and decrees, I learned quickly the weight of being chosen by men, before I knew what it meant to be chosen by God. Perfumed for a king, I was prepared for a crown, but not for calling. I was adorned for favor, but what I longed for was purpose. And yet, even in that place of gold and silken silence, the God of my ancestors whispered, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a stillness that disturbed the soul. I would lie awake in the palace, hearing the echoes of my people's stories, of seas split, of fire that did not consume, of walls that fell at a shout. I wondered if those days were gone. I wondered if the God of Moses still moved behind the veil of power and politics. I wondered if he saw me, hidden behind layers of protocol and paint. The truth is, I was afraid. Not of the king, nor even of death, but of being forgotten by heaven. Because when God is silent, your heart is forced to choose. Will you trust his hand when you cannot see his face? But even in the silence, something eternal stirred. I began to see that the path of obedience was not always lit with signs and wonders, but often walked in trembling, in shadows, in faith that feels like falling. It was there I began to pray differently. Not for favor, but for courage. Not for escape, but for revelation. Not for comfort, but for clarity. What if I had been placed here not to preserve my life, but to lay it down? What if God Himself had planted me in the court of Persia, not to blend in, but to be the hinge upon which a nation's destiny would turn? I could no longer pretend. That neutrality was righteousness. To be silent when heaven was ready to act would be to deny why I had been born. And so I stood, trembling in spirit, stripped of every earthly assurance, but anchored in something deeper, trust in a God who writes His will through surrendered hearts. This is not merely the story of a girl who became queen. It is the story of how God hides His purposes in unlikely vessels, of how divine providence can look like coincidence to those without eyes to see, of how heaven advances not just through power, but through yielded weakness. This is the story of how I found my voice, not in the palace, but in the secret place with my God. And when I opened my mouth to speak before kings, it was not Esther who spoke, but the echo of generations of prayers and the breath of a God who never forgets His covenant. You are not lost. You are not unseen. You are not abandoned. You are positioned. You are prepared. You are beloved. As the heavens watched in silence, I was not there when the king summoned the queen. I had never heard my name whispered in those courts, nor could I have imagined that the rising and falling of an empire's pride would one day become the hinge upon which my own story turned. But now, looking back, I see it clearly. The hand of God, moving in shadows, sowing seeds in silence. King Ahasuerus ruled like the rising sun over the empire of Persia, stretching his dominion from India to Ethiopia. The very breadth of his kingdom felt eternal. His throne stood tall. His banquets never lacked wine, and his splendor was unmatched. To men he appeared as a god, draped in gold, adorned with power. But God is not impressed by crowns. The King of Heaven watches not the scepter, but the heart. I heard of the banquet, how the palace gleamed with marble and silver, how the curtains were woven with fine linen, how the golden goblets held wine without measure. But beneath the feasting, something deeper stirred. Queen Vashti was summoned, not gently, not honorably. She was to come unveiled, to display her beauty like a jewel in the hand of drunken men. She refused. I wonder now if she too was being moved by a spirit she did not yet understand. For though she was cast down for her defiance, a vacancy was carved, not by accident, not by politics, but by providence. At the time, I was just Hadassah, a Jewish girl in exile. I lived quietly under the care of my cousin Mordecai. My parents had died when I was young. I do not remember their voices clearly anymore, only the way my heart used to ache for them during the spring feasts. We lived in Susa, the very city that pulsed with the heartbeat of empire. But we did not belong. We were exiles among pagans, a people with old promises and no visible power. And yet, even in exile, the God of Israel was writing. He writes best in the margins. When the king's anger cooled and his pride festered in the absence of the queen, His advisors offered a solution wrapped in flattery and fear. "Let there be a search," they said. "Let the virgins of the empire be gathered, groomed, and prepared. Let the king choose one who pleases him to wear the crown of Vashti." And so the summons began, an edict sent like ripples across the empire. It found its way to my doorstep. I was not given a choice. They took me from my home, from the prayers I had learned to whisper in secret, from the place where the name of Yahweh was still spoken aloud. They brought me into the palace, into the courts of Susa, into rooms soaked in incense and silence. I was among many girls, chosen not for our wisdom, not for our faith, but for our appearance. We were adorned for display, but inside I clung to something deeper. The God of my fathers had not left me. Though his name was not spoken in these halls, I could feel him like a pulse behind the curtain. Mordecai told me not to reveal my heritage. I obeyed, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Even silence can be a strategy in the hands of God. Perhaps I was being brought into such a story. I did not know what lay ahead, whether I would be seen, forgotten, exalted, or discarded. But I knew this: the God of Abraham does not need armies to move kingdoms. He only needs a yielded heart. And though I walked through marble corridors and slept on embroidered sheets, my heart remained tethered to the one who speaks in dreams, who hides his purposes in places of seeming obscurity, who watches even over girls like me, exiled, quiet, invisible, but not forgotten, never forgotten. The Hidden Year. They called it preparation. 12 months of anointing, cleansing, adorning. 6 months with oil of myrrh. 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. To them it was a ritual of beauty. To me it became a season of burial and becoming. I had been taken from the world I knew, from prayers whispered at night, from Mordecai's quiet guidance, from the cadence of Jewish life. Now I walked through halls gilded with gold, yet I felt more like a lamb among lions than a girl among royalty. I remembered Joseph, how he learned the language of Pharaoh's court, how Daniel prayed with windows open, even under threat, how both carried Yahweh into palaces that did not know his name. So I made my heart a sanctuary. I spoke to God in silence. I fasted in secret, though food was offered without limit. Though I wore perfume on my skin, I sought to carry the fragrance of holiness in my soul. There, in that house of women, surrounded by rival beauty and unspoken fear, I began to understand that favor with men is fleeting, but favor with God carves eternal paths. Each girl waited for her night with the king. She could bring whatever she desired: jewels, robes, anything to please him. But when my turn came, I asked for nothing. Nothing but what Haggai advised. He had watched the palace. He knew what pleased the king. More than that, he watched me, and saw something words could not explain. I believe now it was God's favor, clothing me even before I stood before the king. Not a favor born of ambition, but the quiet grace of one hidden in the hand of the Almighty. When I walked into the throne room, I was no longer Hadassah, the orphan, nor Esther the beautiful. I was simply his. And somehow the king saw what others missed. Not just a face, but a presence. Not just form, but favor. He lifted the royal crown and placed it upon my head. I, a daughter of exiles. I, whose name meant myrtle, hidden and fragrant in obscurity. I was now queen. But even as they celebrated, my heart trembled with a holy knowing. This was not about me. It never had been. The crown was not my reward. It was my assignment. For God does not crown us for comfort, but for calling. Even now I sense the gathering storm, a darkness unseen, a reckoning not yet conceived, one that would demand more than beauty. It would demand courage, and more than courage, surrender. Mordecai visited the gate often. He could not enter, but his presence was a lifeline. He reminded me who I was beneath the silks and titles. He was the voice of Yahweh, steady and unwavering, even from a distance. Through him, I learned of the plot. Two of the king's guards, Bigthan and Teresh, whispering treachery. Mordecai heard it. I told the king, and it was written in the book of Chronicles. No reward came then. But heaven was keeping account. Even small acts done in faith echo in eternity. I was beginning to see how the pieces moved. The Lord of hosts plays no hurried game. He moves with wisdom beyond time, preparing deliverance long before danger is born. So I waited, not in fear, but in awe. For I sensed the King above all kings was drawing near. He had chosen me not just to wear a crown, but to bear a burden. And though I did not yet know the cost, I whispered again my silent yes. Even if it broke me, even if it cost everything, I was his, and he was with me. When shadows rise. It began subtly, like a cloud on the far horizon, barely visible. Haman. His name was known before his footsteps ever echoed through the palace halls. They said he was cunning, that he understood the art of influence. But what I came to know was this. He was a man who worshipped power and bowed to none but himself. King Ahasuerus exalted him, set his seat above all the other princes. Every official at the king's gate bowed before him, all except one. Mordecai, my Mordecai, the one who raised me, who taught me Yahweh's ways in secret, who planted truth in my heart like seeds in dry soil. He refused to bow, and I knew why. Because there are postures the people of God can never take, not even when the cost is high. Word spread swiftly. Mordecai stands when all others kneel, and Haman's heart, already swollen with pride, twisted into something darker. It was not enough to punish one man. He wanted to erase an entire people, our people, my people. Though no one knew it yet, I too wore the mark of Mordecai's defiance in my blood. I, the queen, was born of the same lineage. a daughter of Zion clothed in Persian silk. Haman cast lots, Purim, to choose the day of our destruction. And the day was chosen by chance, but I believe heaven watched. Then came the decree that on the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar, every Jew, young and old, woman and child, will be annihilated. The city of Susa fell into confusion, but inside the palace there was silence. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his garments and stood at the king's gate, weeping. I sent him clothes, but sackcloth cannot be replaced with silk, not when blood has been marked for spilling. Then came the message, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone will escape. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Such a time as this. Could it be? I trembled. I had not been summoned in 30 days. Yet something deeper stirred in me, ancient and divine. So I replied to Mordecai, "Go, gather the Jews, fast for me. I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish." It was not despair, it was consecration. For when death is embraced for God's sake, it loses its sting. I withdrew from the perfumes and silks and wrapped myself in prayer. I sought the face that had been with me since childhood. I was afraid, but fear, when laid on the altar, becomes fire, and I felt it burning in my bones, a holy resolve, a quiet yes. I was not merely the king's bride. I was Yahweh's vessel. The hour had come. The shadow had risen. But the light was beginning to rise in me. The throne room of fire. The third day came like a hush before the storm. I rose from prayer, not with ease, but with surrender. The fast had stripped me of strength, of fear, of self. What remained was something weightier than courage. It was obedience. I dressed not for beauty, but for battle. The royal garments were placed upon me, but beneath them my soul wore sackcloth still. I adorned myself as a queen of Persia, but my heart burned as a daughter of Zion. Each step toward the throne room was a prayer, each breath a plea. O Lord, if I perish, let it be in your hands. The doors loomed ahead, guarded by silence and law. No one approached the king unless summoned. To do so was to gamble with death. And yet I crossed the threshold. Time slowed. The marble beneath my feet felt cold, yet I burned within. The golden columns soared like sentinels, the air heavy with incense and tension. All eyes turned. And there, at the far end, sat Ahasuerus, crowned, regal, watching. I could not see his heart, but I knew the one who held it. In that moment, heaven held its breath. The silence was a blade at my neck. Then he extended the golden scepter. Mercy, the Lord did not bend often, but it bowed that day, not to me, but to the invisible king I served. I touched the scepter, I lived, and yet something deeper within me awakened. I knew this was only the beginning. He looked at me with curiosity and favor. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be granted." Such words, sweet to the ear, but they were not my prize. I had not come for half a kingdom. I had come for a whole people. Yet wisdom whispered, "Not yet. Wait, watch, weigh the heart of the king." So I did not speak of Haman. Not yet. Instead, I invited him to a feast, a small table, an open door. "Let the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared." There are moments when strategy becomes anointed, and this was one. I was not delaying, I was aligning. For God is never hurried, and he writes deliverance not in haste, but in layers. The king agreed, Haman came. And so the first feast was set. The table was rich, but my spirit hungered still. Again the king asked, "What is your petition?" And again I answered with a holy delay, "If I have found favor, come again tomorrow, and then I will speak." It wasn't fear, it was obedience, for the timing of heaven is not ours to command. That night the city slept, but heaven stirred. The king could not rest. The chronicles of the kingdom were read to him, and within their pages Mordecai's name. The man who saved the king's life was finally remembered. Coincidence? No. God was setting the stage, unseen, unrushed, unstoppable. And while Haman built gallows for Mordecai in his pride, God was exalting the humble. It was no longer a story of palace and politics. It was a war of altars. One man bowed to self, another to Yahweh. And heaven would make its choice known. I lay that night with fire in my bones. The second feast would come, and with it, the reckoning. When God remembered. That night I could not sleep, and though I lay in my chambers, it was not I alone who felt the stirring. And on that night, neither the king could sleep. He tossed beneath silks and shadows, while heaven stirred unseen. For when God desires to move, he can withhold rest from kings and disturb the stillness of earthly palaces. A divine hand reached through the veil of the night and tapped gently on the king's mind. He summoned for the book of remembrance to be brought, those scrolls of records and chronicles that time forgets but heaven never does. I did not know then what was unfolding behind the veil, but I know the author of our stories, and he does not write by accident, just a book, just a reading, just words on a page, so it seemed. But within that book was buried the memory of a deed, a quiet act of loyalty that had gone unrewarded. Mordecai, the Jew, the gatekeeper, the one who sat humbly in sackcloth days before, weeping for his people. A man who had once overheard a plot of betrayal and had spoken up not for glory, but for righteousness. And now, heaven whispered, "It is time." As the king pondered how to honor this forgotten man, Haman stepped into the court, proud, presumptuous, intoxicated by power. He had come to speak of death, of gallows, of Mordecai's end. But God's timing is never early, never late. Just as Haman plotted to destroy, God was preparing to exalt. Whom would the king delight to honor? The king asked. And Haman, blinded by pride, hearing only the echo of his own name, laid out his dream, a royal robe, the king's own horse, a crown of splendor, a noble procession, a public declaration. And when the king replied, "Do so for Mordecai the Jew," time froze for Haman. Now the lips that thirsted for Mordecai's destruction trembled with dread. Haman was commanded to lead the horse, to proclaim Mordecai's honor, to walk ahead of him in shame. The man who once stood tall in arrogance now bowed under the weight of divine irony. Mordecai had not sought this moment, but when a heart bows low before God, heaven is never silent forever. The robe denied to Joseph was later placed upon his shoulders. The honor that eluded David found him in Jerusalem. Now Mordecai's name rose before a pagan king, not through politics, but through providence. The same God whose name is hidden in Esther's scroll had never been absent. He sees, he remembers, he exalts the humble and brings the proud to their knees. The gallows still stood, but I knew deep in my spirit it would not be Mordecai who hung upon it, because the God of Israel remembers. He remembers those who weep in the shadows. He remembers the faithful gatekeepers, every act of obedience that the world forgets. And when the time is right, his right, he lifts up the lowly and casts down the proud. The Unmasking. I woke before dawn. The palace was still, but in the unseen realms I knew the battle had shifted. The second banquet would be today, and with it the veil would be torn. I washed my face in silence, not just to remove sleep, but to remember I was alive. The scepter had been extended, but the mission was not complete. I stood once more in royal robes. But it was not regalia that gave me strength. It was the invisible anointing of purpose, and the holy dread that came from carrying God's burden in fragile hands. This was not merely about people and politics. It was the collision of two kingdoms, one seen, the other sovereign, and the time for revelation had come. The banquet room flickered with golden light, fine wine, perfumed air, and polished laughter filled the space. Ahasuerus reclined, indulgent. Haman sat beside him, still drunk on power and proximity. But I drank a different cup, one mixed with oil and intercession. As the food was cleared, the king leaned forward. Once again his question returned. "What is your request, Queen Esther? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done." I looked into his eyes. I saw no anger, no shadow. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my request, and the life of my people for my desire." Silence. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, I would have kept silent. But this enemy seeks to erase us. The king's face shifted, confusion, then fury. Who is he? Where is he, this man who has dared to do this? A foe and enemy, This wicked Haman, his face drained, panic, terror. The man who strutted through the palace now collapsed in his seat, because the Lord had unmasked him, not just before the king, but before the court of heaven. The king rose, thunderstruck, and stormed into the garden. Even kings must wrestle with conviction. Haman, desperate, shattered, fell before me, pleading for his life. But his repentance was to me, not to God. It was fear, not remorse. And when the king returned and saw him fallen across my couch, his wrath exploded. It was over. The gallows Haman built for Mordecai were now his own undoing. The judgment he plotted became the snare for his own soul. As they led him away, I did not rejoice. There is no gloating in justice. But my heart gave thanks. For Yahweh, though hidden, had never been absent, and his righteousness had not slept. Later that day I stood before the king again, no longer for myself, but for the lives of countless others. The edict of destruction had been sealed. It could not be revoked, but a new decree of deliverance could be written. And so it was. The signet ring once worn by Haman now sealed a promise of protection, and Mordecai, robed, honored, exalted, became the sign of reversal. Where death had written its sentence, God had inscribed mercy. That night I wept, not because I was afraid, but because I had seen the hand of God. He had used a girl in exile, an orphan, a hidden one, to preserve his covenant, to protect his people, to prove once again that though he may seem silent, he is never still. And even when his name is not spoken, his will is never absent. The reversal. They call it Purim now, a feast of casting lots, of reversal and joy. But before there was laughter, there were ashes. Before there was celebration, there was mourning. I remember how the words spread, from citadel to countryside, from the palace walls to the outermost provinces. It began with a decree, sealed not by fear, but by authority redeemed. It bore the king's mark, yes, but it bore heaven's breath more. And Mordecai, he stood like a tree suddenly in bloom. The same man who once sat in sackcloth at the gate now wore royal robes of blue and white, a golden crown upon his head. But what moved me was not his clothing, it was the fire in his eyes. The same fire that once burned in my uncle's quiet rebukes, now blazed as a living torch of hope for our people. He had become the voice of the voiceless. Every province received the new decree, not to retaliate, but to defend, not to kill, but to live. The date remained the same, the day Haman had marked for our destruction. It was not erased, it was reclaimed. And that is God's way, is it not? He does not always prevent the trial, but he transforms the trial into testimony. He does not pluck us out of fire, but walks with us in the flames, until what was meant to consume us refines us instead. The empire had prepared for a massacre, but what came was an awakening. The dread that once hung over the Jewish heart was now eclipsed by a strange, rising boldness. Mothers stood taller. Fathers taught their children the name of the God who sees. Even strangers feared to harm us. Some among the nations turned toward our God, because they saw, perhaps for the first time, a people not merely preserved, but chosen. I walked through the city in silence. The streets no longer whispered despair. Children ran again. Merchants sang their old songs. There was bread on the tables and oil in the lamps. And inside me a prayer was forming, not with words, but with tears. God of our fathers, God of the silent places, God who hides, yet holds. You have not forgotten us. I do not understand all your ways, but I have tasted your faithfulness. There were still questions, there were still wounds, but in that season, joy became holy. It wasn't shallow, it came with cost, but it was real, and it was ours. I often returned to the chamber where I first knelt to pray for courage. It was smaller than the throne room, less adorned. But in that quiet space, God had met me. Not with visions or thunder, but with the steadiness of unseen strength. I understood then what true royalty meant. Not the crown, but the calling. Not the robe, but the readiness to be spent for those whom God loves. Years later, as we declared the Feast of Purim throughout the empire, I watched the joy in the people's eyes, and I whispered to the Lord, "Let them always remember, not the danger, not the enemy, but the Lord whose fire burns in Zion." A different crown. And though history may fade, let the Spirit of Christ rise within each daughter, not as a tale to be told, but as a fire to be rekindled, in every generation that dares to believe in God through the unseen. Let the daughters of exile rise from the shadows. Let the trembling find their voice. Let the crownless remember their calling. Let faith speak louder than fear. When darkness gathers, when silence thickens, when the cost is great and the name is forgotten, still let them rise, let them stand, let them intercede, let them shake kingdoms with whispered prayers and dauntless courage. Because the story was never about thrones or veils, but about a God who hides not to disappear, but to draw us nearer. Let courage awaken, let destiny unfold, let Esther's rise. For such a time as this.
If this message has blessed your heart, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Help us spread the light so that others too may find comfort, truth, and hope. Let's walk this quiet road of faith together.